When I returned from a quiet visit with an old friend, I expected to find the front porch light on and the warm hum of home waiting behind the door. Instead, I found my life boxed up and dumped like trash. My lamp was lying sideways on the doormat. My suitcase sat against the bushes, half unzipped. On top of everything taped to a photo frame of me and my son was a folded piece of paper. 6 words. No warning, no explanation, just a quiet erasure. And in that moment, I realized something deeper than betrayal had happened. It wasn't just about being pushed out. It was about being replaced without a second thought. Have you ever stood at your own doorstep and realized you no longer belonged there? The air was still that evening, like the kind of quiet before a thunderstorm. I had only been gone a few days, visiting an old friend upstate. Nothing dramatic, no arguments, no lingering tension. At least none I had let myself feel. The house had been calm when I left. Brendan even hugged me at the car. Kayla said she'd water the garden. But as I stepped from the rideshare onto the driveway, something felt wrong. The porch light wasn't on. The windows were dark. Then I saw it. My suitcase set neatly beside a plastic storage bin. On top sat a pillow I had sewn myself decades ago, edges frayed with time. My night lamp. 2 framed photographs, one of my late husband, one of the 3 of us when Brendan was in college. And next to them, folded once and pinned under a magnet, was a note scrawled in Brendan's handwriting. Sorry, Mum. No space for you anymore. No punctuation. No signature. I stood still for a long while. I didn't cry. I didn't knock. There was nothing to say. I lifted my suitcase, carefully placed the photos inside, tucked the lamp under my arm. I walked away from the door without looking back. My steps didn't echo. No one opened the curtain. The silence was louder than shouting ever could be. At the corner of the street, I stopped, turned around just once. The porch was still dark. I kept walking. I spent that first night on a bench near the community garden just a few blocks from the house. It wasn't the most comfortable place to rest, but I wasn't ready to call anyone yet. I needed silence. Not the cold silence of a locked door, but the soft, unassuming kind that lives in early morning air and the rustle of maple leaves. The garden had always been my place of calm. Years ago, before Kayla came into the picture, Brendan helped me build a compost bin there. I taught him how to trim herbs without damaging the roots. I used to bring him here after school when he was small. Now I sat in the same spot, older, stiffer, but still trying to piece things together. The sun was just beginning to rise when I walked to the bus stop nearby. I didn't have a clear destination. I just needed to move. By mid-morning, I found myself walking past a row of townhouses not far from the park. One of them looked familiar. Brendan and Kayla had talked about possibly moving there one day. It was a newer development with wide windows and polished railings. And then I saw them. Through the sheer curtains of the corner unit, I spotted Brendan standing near the dining table. Kayla sat across from him, flipping through a folder. Their heads were close, their expressions focused. Kayla laughed. Brendan gave a tight smile. She held something up. It looked like a real estate brochure. A large photo of a kitchen was visible with glossy white countertops. She pointed at it with enthusiasm. Brendan looked away. He picked up a mug, brought it to his lips, but didn't drink. His eyes drifted toward the window, and for a split second I thought he saw me. But he didn't react. Maybe he wasn't looking at anything at all. Kayla said something else, and Brendan nodded slowly. His shoulders slumped the way they did when he was a teenager, and didn't want to argue. That was when something inside me shifted. All the tiny moments from the past few months returned like puzzle pieces falling into place. The time Kayla insisted on handling the utility bills. The way Brendan avoided talking about the house whenever I brought it up. The strange mail with his name but my address. The small hesitations in his voice. I had missed the signs. Or maybe I had chosen not to see them. I stood there until the curtain moved slightly as if brushed by the wind. My legs felt heavy as I walked away, not from exhaustion, but from a growing weight I couldn't yet name. There was no confrontation that day, no banging on the glass or shouting through the door. Just the quiet realization that something deliberate had unfolded behind my back. It wasn't a heat-of-the-moment decision. It was planned, calculated, and I had been the last to know. I walked farther than I needed to, ended up at the edge of the lake near the library. The surface of the water was still. I sat on the stone wall and let the stillness settle into me. I didn't cry, but for the first time since I had read that note, I began to wonder how deep the damage truly ran, and just how far back it began. The morning after I wandered toward the public library, not for books, but for the plug-in outlets and quiet. My phone had died sometime in the night, and I hadn't brought a charger on my trip, thinking I'd be home by now. I found a corner near the window, plugged the phone in, and let it buzz back to life. Only one notification blinked on the screen. A missed call. Brendan. No voicemail, no text. Just the timestamp around 11:42 p.m. the night before. I stared at it for a moment. He hadn't followed up. I closed the screen and slipped the phone into my pocket. A familiar voice broke the quiet. Someone saying my name, soft at first, then clearer. I turned and saw Martina Wilkes. We hadn't seen each other in nearly 6 years. She had been a colleague of mine when I worked in legal insurance review. Smart, sharp-tongued, the kind of woman who read the fine print with a magnifying glass and never missed a deadline. She had always worn her confidence like armor. We hugged briefly. She asked what brought me in. I gave a vague response. Just passing time. She nodded, sensing I wasn't ready to spill. She offered coffee from the machine down the hall, and we sat near the side window. After some light chatter about aging knees and politics, she leaned in. She told me she'd run into Kayla a week ago at a local property mixer. Said Kayla was all smiles, talking about plans for the house, possibly listing it soon. There was a new development opening up, and she and Brendan were looking into it. Martina assumed I had already downsized and moved out. I didn't answer right away. Martina read my face like a document under review. She sat up straighter. "Something doesn't feel right," she said. I nodded slowly, letting the silence confirm it. Martina asked if I had access to the house title. I said I used to. She encouraged me to double-check ownership details. Said she once handled a case where a daughter-in-law had power of attorney, switched quietly, moved her mother-in-law into assisted living and flipped the house in less than 6 weeks. I felt the colour leave my face. But not from fear, from recognition. I had brushed off so many moments. Kayla, offering to manage the water bill. Brendan forgetting to hand me the insurance notice. The missing checkbook last spring. They weren't accidents. Martina offered to help. She still consulted part-time for women in complicated family transitions. She had seen too many mothers edged out of their own homes by paperwork and polite lies. She handed me her card, though I already had her number stored deep in an old notebook back home. We sat in silence for a while. She didn't press. That was the thing about old friends. They gave space without explanation. Later that day, I walked to the post office and rented a small box. My name, my address, even if it was just a metal drawer in a federal building. A place to redirect anything Kayla or Brendan might still be trying to claim. That evening, as I watched the sun stretch across the sidewalk outside the shelter I had checked into, I felt something different than sadness. A kind of quiet clarity. The storm wasn't over. But now I was finally turning to face it. The key still worked. I hadn't stepped foot inside my old studio in over 5 years, but somehow my hand knew the turn, the slight resistance in the lock, the gentle push to get the warped door to open. The second-floor space above the old bookstore used to be where I met clients back when I did part-time consulting for insurance claims. After Richard passed, and the house felt too full of memories, I'd kept the lease on this place as a sort of quiet retreat. No one but me and Martina ever came here. The air smelled like time had folded in on itself. Dust and lemon oil, the faint trace of printer ink and dried lavender from the sachet I had left in a drawer. I walked slowly, touching the edge of the bookshelf, running my fingers along the old desk I once used to sort policy paperwork and pension forms for widows who had no one else to help them. In the back cabinet, beneath a stack of manila folders and a faded holiday mug, I found what I needed. The original deed, the notarized copy of the title, all of it still in my name. Brendan's wasn't mentioned anywhere, not even as a beneficiary. I sat down at the desk and spread out everything in front of me. There was more. I found the co-ownership agreement Richard and I had drawn up when we bought the house. It explicitly stated that if one of us passed, the other retained full rights. Brendan had never been added, never discussed. We wanted him to make his own life, not take ours. Then came the stack of bills I had kept out of habit. Water, electricity, trash. I flipped through the most recent ones I had brought from the house. All were now addressed to Kayla. My name had been wiped clean. It hadn't been gradual. It had been fast, quiet, surgical. A copy of a utility request form with a forged signature sat at the top of one envelope. I could tell it wasn't my handwriting. They had already begun the process of replacing me not just in the house, but on paper, as if I had never existed. I didn't cry. Instead, I got up, opened the small fireproof safe I kept under the desk, and placed the deed and the old agreement inside. I added a copy of my ID and the last tax return that still listed the property under my name. Then I locked it. I looked around the room once more. No pictures of Brendan here. Just a photo of Richard and me at a fundraiser, both laughing, both in the middle of living. I closed the door softly behind me, not because I feared it would slam, but because something sacred had just been disturbed. They thought I was out, but they had no idea what I still held, not just legally, but in memory, in resolve, and in proof. The next morning I stood quietly at the crosswalk outside Martina's office, clutching an envelope tight beneath my coat. Around me, the city hummed with movement, people streaming past with coffee cups and earbuds, thinking about meetings, errands, and nothing close to what I carried in my hands. They didn't know I had been erased slowly and deliberately, but I knew. Martina greeted me with that familiar, no-nonsense look. Her office still smelled like lavender oil and copier paper exactly as I remembered. I laid the documents out on her desk without saying a word. The house deed, the joint ownership agreement from decades ago, the forged utility requests, the tax papers, the pieces of me they had tried to cut out. Martina didn't flinch. She skimmed every page, slowly flipping back twice, then leaned back in her chair. "This is no mistake," she said. "They're laying groundwork to remove you, and I think they know you won't fight back." Her words didn't sting. They just settled into a space that had been empty for a long time. A space where I had once been someone who acted, who calculated risk, who spoke with certainty. She picked up her phone and called in a favor. Within minutes, she had a name, Ashby Sterling, a retired estate attorney who used to specialize in asset protection for older women. According to Martina, she didn't just read contracts, she read people. 2 days later, I stood on the porch of Ashby's home office. The house was small, tidy, and quiet. A white wooden swing swayed in the breeze, and the curtains in the front window shifted like someone had just walked past them. Ashby greeted me with a calm nod and led me inside. She was older than me, maybe by 5 years, with short silver hair and a presence that didn't need to fill space to command it. I handed her everything. She read slowly. Her eyes moved like a surgeon's hands. When she was done, she folded her fingers and said evenly, "None of this changes the fact that you're still the sole legal owner. The utilities being moved, the mail redirect, the digital address change. It's circumstantial. It's not lawful transfer. But if they attempt to use it to leverage a sale or a refinance that becomes fraud." I nodded, feeling the heat return to my cheeks. I hadn't even realized how cold I'd been. Ashby walked me through the next steps. A formal cease and desist letter. Notification to the county clerk's office to flag any attempted transactions. Documentation filed with a soft restriction that would delay any unauthorized movement of title. It wasn't dramatic, but it was effective. We printed everything that day. I signed with a pen that didn't shake. Martina arranged for a courier to deliver one sealed envelope to Brendan's office and another to Kayla's last known workplace. Ashby also suggested filing a protective memorandum with the neighborhood council. That step would alert local legal realtors and banks in the area that any claim on the house not coming from me was to be treated with caution. It wouldn't stop them outright, but it would slow them down. That afternoon, I stood in the hallway of Ashby's office, waiting for my ride. I glanced in the mirror hanging near her coat rack. I looked tired, but behind my eyes something new had settled. A steadiness, a line had been drawn. They hadn't taken everything. They had just taken my silence for granted, and that mistake they would come to regret. By the end of that week, every letter had been sent. One by courier to Brendan's law firm downtown. One to Kayla's office at the wellness clinic, where she managed scheduling and finance. Another copy filed at the county office, flagged and sealed. I hadn't spoken a word to either of them since I left the house that morning with my suitcase. Then, on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, my phone started ringing. Brendan's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring out, then again, and again. No voicemails, no texts, just repeated calls spaced like he was hoping to catch me off guard. By the 6th attempt, a message finally came in, from Kayla. It read short and sharp. "You didn't have to go this far. I sat with that message for a long while. I didn't reply. But later that night, I sent one line. Everything has a reason. So does this." I knew the silence would be louder than any explanation. The next morning, I stopped by my old neighborhood just after sunrise. I didn't go to the house. I only walked along the sidewalk near the park, passing the garden where I used to take Brendan when he was little. I could see the backyard from a distance. The blinds were drawn. By noon, Martina called me. Brendan had emailed her firm's generic inbox asking if the documents were valid. Ashby answered herself professionally and briefly. She confirmed the cease and desist was active. She included her license number and offered to direct him to the property records if he needed independent confirmation. There were no legal threats, no accusations, just a wall of clarity. That evening, Brendan showed up at my studio. He knocked, then waited a long time. I opened the door just enough to see his face. His eyes were tired, less angry than confused. He asked if we could talk. I stepped aside, not to welcome him, but to show I wasn't afraid. He stood by the window looking down at the stack of papers on my table. He said he hadn't known about everything, that Kayla had taken the lead because she thought I needed rest, that it wasn't supposed to escalate this far. I didn't interrupt. Finally, I asked one thing, not as a mother, but as a woman speaking to a grown man who should have known better. Why didn't you stop her? He looked at the floor. His answer came slowly. Because I didn't want the conflict. because it felt easier to step back, because I didn't think you'd push back. It wasn't cruelty, it was cowardice. He hadn't chosen her over me. He had chosen silence over discomfort. And that I realized was its own kind of betrayal. He asked if there was anything he could do now. I told him the letters had been sent. The alerts had been filed. The title was no longer vulnerable. The house was no longer in question. I didn't tell him everything, but I told him enough. When he left, I closed the door gently behind him, not with rage, not with grief, just a quiet kind of certainty, the kind you carry when you've already lost the illusion of family and found something steadier in its place, yourself. The next few days passed without another word from Brendan or Kayla. I didn't expect an apology, and I certainly didn't expect understanding, but I did expect movement, a reaction, and when it came, it was calculated. Saturday morning, a courier arrived, a white envelope with my name neatly typed, no return address. Inside was a letter from a real estate firm addressed not to me, but to Brendan and Kayla. A carbon copy of an internal inquiry form was included, requesting documents for pre-sale evaluation of the house. My house. I didn't panic. I just called Martina. She met me at my studio an hour later, scanned the letter and cursed under her breath. We both knew what this meant. They were trying to test the system to push past the alerts Ashby had placed, maybe hoping someone in the system wouldn't catch it. A quiet attempt. Another shadow move. Martina was ready. She called Ashby and forwarded the documents. Within hours, Ashby filed a second-level restriction with the property office and flagged the realtor directly with legal notification. Any further attempt to inquire about the home would require direct authorization from me, notarized and certified. The wall around my house was now reinforced. Still, the audacity stunned me. Not just the attempt to erase me from the deed, but to pretend I had never mattered. As if the years I spent building that home, the love poured into its corners, could be dismissed with a signature forged in convenience. That night I slept lightly. Sunday afternoon, Brendan came again. He didn't knock, just stood outside the door until I opened it. His eyes held something tighter this time. Not desperation, more like strategy. He asked if we could talk. I nodded but didn't invite him inside. He stood on the porch. He said Kayla had made a mistake, that things had moved too fast, that she was scared I would retaliate, make everything public. He kept using words like misunderstanding, oversight, communication gap. I didn't say much. I let the silence work harder than any argument. Then I looked him in the eye and said what I had been holding in since this began. You knew. You always knew. And you let it happen because it benefited you. He didn't argue. He said he never wanted it to come to this, that he was tired, that standing between me and Kayla was impossible. That was the moment something inside me shifted for good, because I finally saw it clearly. He hadn't been manipulated. He hadn't been trapped. He had made a choice, not because he hated me, but because standing with me would have required courage, and comfort was easier than courage. I thanked him for coming. Then I closed the door, not angrily, not with bitterness, just with the finality of someone who had seen the truth unmasked, and could no longer pretend not to see. The morning fog hung low as I crossed the street toward Martina's office, a bag of scones in hand, and a sense of quiet resolve in my chest. Something told me things weren't done unraveling, and I was right. Martina stood by her window when I entered. She didn't turn to greet me. She just held up a file thick with printed pages and said calmly, "I think we've got a problem." She spread the papers across her desk. The first was a digital printout of a loan pre-approval application from a regional bank. It had Brendan's name on it, and mine. Next to mine was a signature that looked eerily familiar, but it wasn't mine. It was a sloppy copy of my name, dragged and dropped into boxes I never saw. Martina had pulled the documents from a private records monitor she used for certain clients. Something about Brendan's activity had triggered a soft red flag. He had created an online account under a joint ownership profile, submitted fabricated authorization forms, and was attempting to secure a line of credit against the house. The documents included a scanned ID, my old driver's license, and a utility bill with my name barely visible. Just enough to make it look real to someone in a hurry, but not enough to survive scrutiny. Martina's face was tight. This isn't just manipulation. It's criminal. I sat down. My stomach was still not from shock, but from a kind of weary clarity. They weren't just removing me from their lives. They were trying to erase my legal existence too. We called Ashby. She came to Martina's office that afternoon, a leather case tucked under one arm, eyes sharp behind her glasses. She reviewed the paperwork. Took her time, then said evenly, "He's created a fictitious authorization trail. That's forgery, wire fraud, if he submitted anything online." Ashby moved fast. She drafted a formal complaint to the bank's fraud investigation unit, filed a notice with the local district attorney's office under quiet flag protocol. Then she took out a different form, one that would be filed with the neighborhood council and property registrar, freezing any transactions or claims made using my name or address, unless verified by me in person. A silent lockdown. Brendan wouldn't know about it until he tried to move again. But when he did, he would hit a wall. A firm one, built from paper and precision. Martina sat beside me while Ashby worked. Her voice was soft when she said, "Some sons take after their mothers. Others learn from different examples." I didn't respond. I just stared out the window, watching a pair of sparrows wrestle for crumbs on the sidewalk. I thought of Brendan as a little boy running through that same sidewalk with grass-stained jeans and skinned elbows, and then I thought of the man who now tried to write my name into something he didn't earn. By the end of the day, everything was filed. Ashby made sure copies were stored in multiple systems, flagged with alerts, and backed up with notarized affidavits. I left with a folder tucked under my arm and something stronger than anger filling my lungs. It was clarity. They had erased me on paper. But now I had written myself back in. The invitation came in the form of a text from Brendan, short, polite, almost too polite. "We're having a family discussion Saturday. Hope you can come. It's time to clear the air." I stared at the message for a long time. The phrase family discussion sat on the screen like it still meant something, like I still belonged. I didn't respond right away. I forwarded it to Ashby and she replied within minutes. "Let me come with you just in case." Saturday afternoon arrived with grey skies and the kind of wind that made you wrap your coat tighter without thinking. Ashby picked me up in her sensible navy sedan. She had her briefcase and calm presence and a copy of the cease and desist letter notarized and bound. The house looked just as I remembered. White shutters, red door, a planter box full of petunias struggling against the cold. But everything felt different, like walking into a replica of your life built by someone else's hands. Inside the living room was staged, literally, cushions, fluffed candles burning a cheese board on the table. Kayla stood by the fireplace in a tailored sweater, her smile stretched too wide. Brendan greeted us with a handshake, eyes darting between me and Ashby. He looked nervous, not confused, not angry, just prepared. We sat. No one touched the food. Kayla started speaking, her voice smooth like she was presenting a pitch. "We know there's been some tension lately, and we wanted to invite you here to have an open, respectful dialogue. This is still your home too," she said, gesturing toward the room. Ashby reached into her briefcase and set down the letter. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Actually, this home belongs solely to my client, Marjorie Lindell. She remains the legal owner on all official documentation. Any representations otherwise have been formally challenged and recorded. This is not a discussion. It's a confirmation. Silence fell. Brendan paled. Kayla blinked once, then twice. The kind of blink people do when their plans stall mid-air. Ashby continued. We are also aware of forged documents submitted to multiple institutions. Those filings have been reported and flagged. Further action is pending, but for now, my client reserves the right to press charges. Kayla's voice dropped an octave. This isn't how we wanted to do things. I looked at her for the first time that day. Really looked. And I saw it then. The cracks. The loss of control. The realization that whatever story she'd been spinning had just come unraveled. Brendan tried to speak, but stopped himself. He just stared at the document, hands clenched. I stood up. I didn't yell. I didn't make a speech. I just said, "You tried to write me out of my own life. You thought I wouldn't notice." Then I turned to leave. Ashby followed. At the door she paused and said one final line. "If you attempt to interfere again, legal proceedings will follow immediately." Outside the wind was colder, but it felt fresh, cleansing. We didn't talk on the drive back. I didn't need to, because in that silence something had shifted. They had wanted to bury me in paperwork, but I had shown them I was still standing. The next morning, I packed a single overnight bag and walked into the old house one last time. I had the keys. I still held the deed, but ownership and belonging were never quite the same, were they? Kayla was in the kitchen washing dishes with unnecessary force. Brendan sat at the dining table, hands folded like a child waiting to be scolded. They didn't speak. I stood by the threshold for a moment, letting the silence draw its own boundary. Then I said it. "I'm selling the house." Kayla froze. Brendan looked up. Lips parted, but without a word. I continued. "Not for revenge, not to punish anyone, just because it's mine, and I no longer want to share my name with walls that have forgotten me." I placed a folder on the table. Inside was the listing agreement already signed. Ashby had handled everything discreetly with the precision only a woman who's seen it all can carry. Brendan's voice cracked. "But where will you live?" I looked at him not unkindly, but without softness. "That's not your concern anymore." He blinked and looked down. Kayla didn't meet my eyes. I saw the tremble in her shoulders, but offered no comfort. Comfort had been spent. All that remained was clarity. As I turned to leave, I paused. There was one last thing to say, the only thing that mattered. The sale proceeds will not be going into your pockets. I watched Kayla's posture stiffen. Brendan exhaled slowly. I continued. "I've transferred the full amount into a foundation. A fund for women over 60 who've been manipulated, discarded, or silenced by their own families. It will help them find legal support, housing and dignity." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flinch. "Martina will be the executive director. Ashby has agreed to oversee compliance. This house built a family. But families fall apart when love becomes conditional. So I'm letting it go. No threats, no arguments, just a simple fact. You made space by pushing me out. Now I'll make space for someone else who needs it." I didn't wait for a reply. I stepped outside, closed the door gently behind me, and walked down the path like it had never been mine. The sun had risen while I was inside. I hadn't noticed until then. The sidewalk glittered with early frost, and my breath fogged in the air. but I felt warm, warm in a way I hadn't in years. I didn't cry. I didn't look back. Instead, I opened my phone and pulled up the address of my new apartment. Small, quiet, mine. Then I tapped send on the press release Ashby had drafted. The foundation would go public that week. A quiet announcement in the back of a local newsletter, nothing flashy, but I knew someone would read it. And I hoped they would sit with the feeling, not of anger, but of loss. Not because I'd taken anything from them, but because they finally understood what they had thrown away. The apartment was small, but filled with morning light. My bedroom window faced east, and each sunrise spilled over the sill like a quiet promise. I kept things simple. A small reading chair near the window. One framed photograph of me alone at the ocean, taken years ago. A lavender plant in a clay pot. I named it Mercy. There was no television. Just a radio which I turned on in the evenings to listen to local stations, mostly jazz and weather updates. The quiet felt unfamiliar at first. Not empty, just new. Every morning I made tea, laced up my walking shoes, and stepped outside. The path behind the complex led through a narrow trail bordered by low pine trees. I walked the same route daily, waving to the woman who jogged in the opposite direction with her golden retriever. We never exchanged words, but after a few weeks, she smiled first. Some days Martina would visit bringing pastries and talking about the early response to the foundation. Donations were small, but steady. One letter had arrived from a woman in Utah who had read about the fund in a church newsletter. Her story was too familiar. She had written, "Thank you for existing." I read it twice. The old house had officially sold. Kayla and Brendan had moved out before the transfer, as required by the paperwork Ashby filed. They didn't reach out again. There were no calls, no texts. The silence didn't hurt like I had expected. It didn't feel like abandonment anymore. It felt like space. In the evenings, I began writing. Nothing formal, just pages of memory and thought stitched together in a notebook with a soft brown cover. Sometimes I wrote about my childhood. Other times I wrote about silence, how it can be weapon or refuge depending on who holds it. One afternoon, a call came from a women's group in the city. Someone had passed along my name. They were hosting a seminar on elder autonomy and wanted a speaker with lived experience. I said yes, without hesitation. That night I stood at the window looking out over the parking lot. The light from the street lamps drew long shadows across the asphalt. I didn't feel small. I didn't feel erased. I just felt present. There was peace in that. I turned off the light, slipped into bed, and let the silence wrap around me. Not to shut the world out, but to finally hear myself breathe. One afternoon, while rearranging the small storage cabinet under my desk, I found it again. The photo, the one from Brendan's college graduation. Everyone was there. Brendan, Kayla, even my sister-in-law from Nebraska. The frame had always been too large for the photo, so I used to keep a pressed daisy in the corner behind the glass. But what caught me this time was the edge of the image. I hadn't noticed before, or maybe I had refused to. Someone had trimmed the photo. My face had been cut out cleanly, not torn, not crumpled, just surgically removed like I had never stood there beside them. I stared at it for a long while, not out of shock, not even sadness, just recognition. I didn't cry. I didn't throw it away. I simply removed the picture, placed it in a cloth pouch, and tucked it into a wooden box I kept at the back of my closet. Inside that box were old keys, a ribbon from my son's 5th grade spelling bee, and a birthday card signed only by Brendan's child. No mention of Grandma, just a crayon drawing of a balloon. I closed the box gently. No anger, no grief, just stillness. People think healing is loud, that it arrives like thunder, but sometimes it moves like breath, barely there, quiet and slow. But when it arrives, it changes everything. I never erased Brendan or Kayla from my memory. I simply chose not to center my life around people who had edited me out of theirs. There's strength in letting go, not for revenge, not for pride, but for clarity, for peace. That spring I planted new lavender on the windowsill. It bloomed unevenly crooked toward the sun, but it grew. That was enough. I didn't look back, not even once. If this story found a quiet place in you, I thank you for listening. So many women walk through years of silence before they finally choose themselves. Have you ever felt erased, not in words, but in presence? I invite you to share or simply to reflect. Your story, like mine, has weight, and sometimes in telling it or hearing it, we start to bloom again, quietly, steadily, in our own time.